Today's presenters come to us from the University of British Columbia. They will discuss the origins of the Faculty of Medicine's Indigenous Speaker Series, the importance of ceremony and safety in Indigenous events, and the state of Indigenous engagement in Canada. So let me introduce them to you now. Derek Thompson serves as the Director of Indigenous Engagement for UBC's Faculty of Medicine, a leader within the DD First Nation. I hope I got that right. Derek brings over 30 years of experience working with First Nations, organizations, and communities across Canada. At UBC, he hosts the Indigenous Speaker Series, which, in his words, aims to foster complex conversations about truth and reconciliation between those who are from here and those who've arrived here to stay. And it's great to see that Oliver Mann is joining Derek today. Oliver, a lot of us know him well, is a senior communications strategist in UBC's Office of Community Engagement. And he recently completed his MA in professional communications at Royal Roads University. Congratulations. His thesis explores how Canadian universities communicate about Indigenous engagement, advocating for Indigenous-led storytelling and decolonizing communication practices. It also provides actionable recommendations for university communications. I'm going to turn the program over to Oliver and Derek and let them get started, and I'll be back a little bit later. So on to you, gentlemen.
Awesome. Thank you, Betty. Hi, everyone. And yeah, thanks, Betty and Magda, for the introductions and invitation to present to CCECanada. So as Betty mentioned, my name's Oliver Mann. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Senior Communications Strategist for UBC's Office of Community Engagement. And I'm joined today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam speaking peoples, currently known as Richmond, BC. And I also want to acknowledge that UBC's main campus, where I work, is on the territories of the Musqueam people. So originally I was invited to share my recent graduate research about how universities across Canada tell stories about Indigenous engagement, which I'd still be happy to present at another time. But because today is right before the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I thought this group deserved someone way cooler than me. So I reached out to my colleague, Derek Thompson. So today I'm going to play more of a moderator role because I really want us to hear from Derek. And I'm going to ask Derek to introduce himself shortly, but I always like to hype him up a little bit first. So Derek is a hereditary chief of the DD First Nation, which is one of 14 Nichanas communities along the west coast of Vancouver Island. It's still challenging for me to fully grasp what it means to be a hereditary chief, but I know the responsibility is enormous. It includes cultural and spiritual leadership, land and resource stewardship of his nation's territories, conflict resolution within his community, and representation and advocacy to the external world, including negotiating with provincial and federal governments over territorial rights and sovereignty. Among his many responsibilities, UBC has somehow compelled Derek to give us some of his energy, and we are so fortunate for it. I think working as the Director of Indigenous Engagement for UBC's Faculty of Medicine, Derek provides vision, strategic leadership, and diplomacy in advancing the faculty's efforts to establish meaningful, mutually beneficial relationships with Indigenous peoples, nations, communities, and organizations. So one of Derek's signature UBC initiatives is the Indigenous Speaker Series. And actually, let me drop a link in the chat. Or Betty, is it easy enough for you to drop that link? There are many upcoming events that are already published and can be joined virtually. And so I highly recommend attending them if you can. So in my opinion, very few people at UBC compare to the way Derek does Indigenous-led events. His events are ceremony. They prioritize the safety and well-being of his speakers above the institution and participants. They educate and they inspire me to ask, what can I do better to advance truth and reconciliation? So today I'm pleased to be able to have a conversation with Derek and in the presence of such an amazing group like CCECanada's network. So with that, Derek, could you introduce yourself and tell us about your role at UBC's Faculty of Medicine?
Excellent. Thank you, Oliver. And certainly thank you to CCE for the invitation to talk to you today. I know for certain that with your reference that I'm a cool guy, my daughters would be rolling their eyes at this moment. So that's a rare treat to hear that any semblance of cool in any way, shape, or form. So thank you for that. Yeah, my name is Derek Thompson. My ancestral name is Bequila. I come from a small remote community called DT Dot. We're one of 14 Nuu-chah-nulth communities along the west coast of Vancouver Island here in the province of British Columbia. Cayucit First Nation is our most northern Nuu-chah-nulth community. And just above Cayucit is a place called Brooks Peninsula. Dot is our most southern Nuu-chah-nulth community. And between Dot and Victoria is a place called Point No Point. So between those 2 points of geography, Brooks Peninsula in the north and Point No Point in the south, and all of the shoreline between those 2 points and the land inward along a range of mountains is collective Nuu-chah-nulth territory. I think that's important in an era of land and territorial acknowledgements that only about maybe 20 or so years ago, if you combine all of our Nuu-chah-nulth Indian reserves, federal Indian reserves, it was about 10,000 or so hectares compared to what I've just described as unceded collective Nuu-chah-nulth territory. Nuu-chah-nulth people historically weren't migratory. We had seasonal places that we often visited, but we didn't literally uproot our communities and move to another geography. And if you've ever been to the west coast of Vancouver Island, why the hell would you want to leave it in the first place? Right? So my parents are Charlie and Maud Thompson. My late mother was Maud Shaw. Her parents were Irene and Micah Shaw from Kitimat, up in northern BC at the head of Douglas Channel. My maternal grandparents were Irene and Micah Shaw. My grandmother was Irene Larson from Bella Bella. My paternal grandparents were Webster and Ida Thompson. And my grandmother was Ida Modeste from Cowichan tribes. So I have lineage in all of those nations. I started off in the UBC Faculty of Medicine, the Office of Respectful Environments, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion as the Indigenous Advisor. And a couple of years ago, moved into this position as director. Prior to that, I was the director of health for the Saywilton Health Center with Cowichan tribes, situated in Duncan on Vancouver Island, and broadly the Cowichan Valley. And before that, I was working in Ottawa at the First Nations Information Governance Center and have spent 30 or so years only ever working in a First Nations community or organization. So this job brought me here for the first time in my career to work in a non-First Nations or non-Indigenous setting. And when I first started in the Office of Respectful Environments, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Rosalind Goldner, executive director of the time, asked me to put together a presentation of what I thought were important sort of priority issues in the context of the Faculty of Medicine's formal apology and commitment to truth and reconciliation. And when we had the meeting, I had a PowerPoint that was, I don't know, maybe about 15 or 20 minutes. And I ended up talking for about 3 hours. And the premise of my presentation was I was of the opinion that the conversation hasn't even begun between those who are from here and those who've arrived here to stay. So arguably, how then could you reconcile any semblance of relationship between Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous peoples in this province and country? So I started off with the idea that conciliation is more relevant in this era of truth and reconciliation than reconciliation is in and of itself. That there's a real urgency to start the conversation, right? To begin the conversation, to sustain the conversation about these layered and complex issues. And that year, there are a lot of things that happened in 2021, including us coming out of the fog that we call now references COVID-19. That was kind of the first round of the vaccine rollout in this country and around the world. And we were still grappling with this format, this virtual format that we call Zoom. And we learned of the 215 potential grave sites at the former site of the Kamloops Indian residential schools and other Indian residential schools in the province and across the country. And just a year prior, in the lead up to the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and only yesterday on September 28th, 2020, Joyce Echaquan died in an emergency room hospital in Quebec. And subsequent to that, there was a formal inquiry. Joyce's principal was created, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of context there. And if that wasn't enough, the Prime Minister of the day, Justin Trudeau, skipped out on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and was holidaying in Tofino. And despite being invited by Chief Casimir of the Kamloops Indian Band and Chief Wayne Christian, who is a spiritual leader for his people. So he later showed up in October to participate in a solemn ceremony to acknowledge not just the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, but the grave sites that this community was still reeling from in trying to figure out, how do you reconcile that kind of history? So there were a lot of people asking me, I guess because I'm an Indigenous person, I'm a First Nations person, and I have an intense interest in these kinds of issues. And the more people ask me, I thought, well, who cares what I think? I want to know what Chief Casimir thinks, and I want to know what Chief Wayne Christian thinks. So I called them up, and they agreed to participate in a Zoom format, a 90-minute conversation about their thoughts and reflections of the importance of leadership showing up in an era of truth and reconciliation. There's a goofy kind of tension there that instead of showing up to apologize for the wrongs of the past, you're showing up to apologize for not showing up to apologize for the wrongs of the past, right? And who cares if it's just Justin Trudeau, right? He's dating Katy Perry. He's doing all these kind of goofy stuff. Who cares if it's just Justin Trudeau? But the fact that he's the Prime Minister becomes critically important for him to show up, because there are those Canadians amongst us who, beyond ignorance, would like to, for whatever reason, sustain some semblance of prejudice, discrimination, or racism against Indigenous peoples. So they get to say, well, if that guy didn't show up, I'm not going to show up. Why should I have to show up if the Prime Minister isn't showing up? There are some pretty serious implications there, particularly in the context of not just the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, but for the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It makes our job that much more difficult, especially in a time when it's getting tougher and tougher to center Indigenous peoples and issues inside academic institutions. Because amidst those groups of non-Indigenous folks and Canadians and British Columbians, you potentially have leadership, who then get to say, well, if that guy doesn't show up, I don't get to show up. So I invited them, and they both eagerly agreed to participate in the conversation. In November of 2021, I hosted Chief Wayne Christian. Chief Casimir intended to show up, but there was flooding in her region at the time, and she wasn't able to make it. But you can watch the recording of Chief Christian, and man, did he ever show up. Here's a man who's been doing this work for 60 plus years on behalf of our people, and was just completely profound and respectful and dignified and diplomatic about the importance of showing up in an era of truth and reconciliation, particularly where leadership roles are concerned. So that conversation was intended to be sort of a singular conversation. I was interested. A lot of people were interested what Chief Christian thought and what his reflections were. And I stepped away from that conversation just completely blown away by his presence and thought, maybe, a dozen or so people showed up. And we later learned there were a few hundred people that showed up and sustained the 90-minute conversation. So Rosin and I met, and we thought, I think maybe we're onto something here, and really took the time to create what is now known as the Indigenous Speaker Series. And I met with a friend of mine. His name is Sebastian Silva. He owns a consulting company called Roundtable Consulting. I work with him a number of years during my time with Cowichan Tribes, and he understands my approach in terms of my demeanor and sensibility about these types of issues. And he's really good at these types of conversations in the work that he does. So when we met, he kind of laughed and he goes, "Well, Derek, you got to remember that you like to talk too." And you give me a question, I can go on in some election speech about making Canada great again, and people are scratching their head wondering what the hell I'm on about. So we factored that in. So if you look at the layout of the speaker series, it really is intended to be basically a conversation, not only about these types of issues, but how to have these conversations. So there isn't an opportunity to engage the audience to engage. There's no Q&A. And that was done deliberately with the intent to really allow the audience to exercise or strengthen your oblique muscle on our ability to just listen and to reflect on these types of issues. So we hosted our second in-person all-day event this past September last week. And that was our 27th session. We've hosted thousands of people, not only in North America, but in parts of the world, and hope to continue this great good endeavor to really bridge the so-called conversation between those who arrived here and those who are from here.
Thank you, Derek. So last week, I was fortunate to attend your event with Dr. Shane Point and Dr. Suzuki. One of the most impactful elements was the intention and time you dedicate to ceremony. The entire morning was devoted to it. You invited the spirits of your ancestors to join us, honored family members living and recently passed, acknowledged other Indigenous leaders that were present, and you and your family shared songs and stories about your histories and origin stories. And halfway through the event, the ceremony culminated in the sharing of one of your chiefly names, Suhilton, with your uncle Shane Point. I think for some people in the audience, while they may have experienced Indigenous performances before, this might have been their first opportunity to experience ceremony. And so my question is, why is ceremony so important to your events?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. That's a really, really important question. And arguably, I could spend the rest of this conversation just talking about that. So I'll try and be succinct as I can. This day became critically important for me, in a very personal way. My mom died in March of this year, And so the process of grieving becomes critically important to me, more so because my mom is no longer with me. So New Channels people, the people that I come from, when we potlatch, when we do things of a significant cultural or ceremonial purpose, whatever the reason, we could be welcoming babies into the world. We could be marrying people. We could be seating a new chief. Whatever the reason is, the first order of business when New Channels people come together to do cultural and ceremonial work, the very first thing we do, above anything else, is we acknowledge those in our presence who are grieving, who have lost a family member recently. And despite their intense grief, they're here. They're here to gather. They're here to be with the family. They're here to support the work. They're here to come together with other people. So, in thinking about last week's event and certainly events of the past, the process to stand people up and to acknowledge people who are grieving is really important. Um, we have two terms generally in New Channels that we call archeha. Archeha are those ancestors whom we knew in life but are no longer with us. And Aryaquimit are our ancestors whom we never knew at all, but we know we're inextricably linked to them in some way, shape, or form. So we invite our ancestors into that space. We literally chant a profound and deeply meaningful prayer chant. And when we use our rattle, if you think of a rattle, if you watch Nuu people use a rattle, we're going in a counterclockwise position as we're singing our prayer chant. And that is literally symbolic of winding back time. We're collapsing time. And as we're doing that, that ancient chant invokes the spirits of our ancestors into that space. We welcome our ancestors into that space and we seat them. And as we're seating them, we ask them to dignify us. We ask them to dignify the work that we're about to do and to be mindful and respectful of each other, that we know that these conversations are difficult. They're often layered and complex. Various opinions come into play. Perspectives of history come into play, so on and so forth. So it's a difficult thing to do. So we call our ancestors to come and dignify us, that we can be mindful and respectful of each other and not cause any harm or offense to each other while we're doing this important work. So this year, it was it was an intense reminder, given that I was inviting my mom into the space for the first time in my life. So, ceremony, the process of ceremony becomes really important, especially in the context of the conversation I had last week with David Suzuki and my uncle, Shane Point. We introduced the idea of climate change, talking about climate change in an era of truth and reconciliation. And Dr. Suzuki has for quite a while talked about the urgency to really build on the idea of communities of resilience, bringing communities of people together, neighborhoods of people together, families together, that in this day and age, we see all over the world governments failing their commitments to climate change. Over and over again, we see monumental type industrial projects like LNG in the pipeline here in this province being implemented despite the public's outcry that this should not go forward. We need to figure out, our unhealthy relationship to fossil fuels, so on and so forth, that, because governments aren't going to figure this out for us, there's a real urgency for us to come together in terms of community resilience. And in his book, Dr. David Suzuki's book called The Sacred Balance, there's a passage that he wrote, and I'll just read his quick paragraph. He says in his book, rituals are a public affirmation of meaning, value, connection. They tie people to each other, to their ancestors, and to their place in the world together. Anthony Stevens points out that while industrialized nations have achieved extraordinary levels of wealth, consumer goods, and amenities, more and more people yearn for community and rituals that bind them together. This desire intensifies as family breakdown becomes more common, and adults and children alike suffer the consequences. So, I thought, well, it's interesting when you're talking about communities' resilience. Well, that to me sounds a lot like truth and reconciliation, where you're trying to bring and bridge peoples of various communities, beliefs, and backgrounds together to figure out their relationship. And my experience in that context is that that's not easy work. It's difficult work. Truth and reconciliation is hard work. And like any meaningful relationship, it requires work, right? Beyond the intensity of love and lust, arguably, in any relationship, um, and especially where intimate relationships are concerned, you kind of get into it where you're kind of questioning, well, why am I doing all the work in this relationship? Right? We've all been in various relationships, um, intimate or otherwise, where we question, why am I doing all the work here? That's not fair. And we start to take a different stance in that relationship. It can get defensive. It can become distant. It can even break up relationships. You move on to another relationship. So, I just think there's a real need and urgency, as Suzuki and pointed out last week, that if we're going to do anything, if we're going to shift this relationship, it's going to require above and beyond the more um, formal constructs around this work, whether it be tip sheets or modules or videos or some kind of didactic instructional clinical guidelines, all of the formality, the structure around those kind of things. And we do need those things. But above and beyond that, it's going to require a real purposeful, meaningful approach to establishing these connections, and it's through ceremony. And it doesn't have to be complex. Just at the beginning of this month, the neighborhood I live in, Kitsilano here in Vancouver, we hosted our fourth annual block party. And this is a chance for our entire block to come together and our kids meet and they have fun and we eat different food and we visit and we get to know each other and we've embedded different issues. Each year we've embedded different issues. This year was fire safety. So next year, hopefully we start bringing these more complex issues in terms of our own neighborhood. So ceremony really is the foundation of that. And I think it's important that in an era of truth and reconciliation, there's a real need to bring back some sense of ceremony and ritual that bring us together. It doesn't have to be super complex. It could be something as straightforward as sharing a meal together and bringing in song and dance and storytelling and a sense of community and purpose that unites people, as opposed to there's so much going on in the world that divides people, right? Yeah.
So last year, you hosted amazing event on September 25th called Coming Home. And this was a panel discussion with over a dozen Indian residential school survivors and their children. And so it was really impactful to me when I was in the room, how you prioritize the safety of your speakers and how you explained to the audience that you had provided all the questions to the panel in advance and that there'd be absolutely no opportunity for audience questions. And so, since many of us today in this Zoom room likely organize events with Indigenous peoples, can you speak more about safety in events?
Mm-hmm. That's a really important question. So when we first started out with the Indigenous Speaker Series, there was many who held the opinion that there should be engagement, there should be Q&A, there should be. And I held strong to the belief that it shouldn't. Because I'm asked a lot and was asked a lot about how to have these conversations. And I thought, well, it really should be an opportunity for people to exercise the ability to just listen. So, for non-Indigenous folks, the speaker series is exactly that. It's just an opportunity for you to bear witness to these many conversations. And in the effort to exercise your ability to listen, you can then arrive at some hopefully meaningful way to make that a nuanced approach within and of yourself, right? And for Indigenous folks, it's an opportunity to see and hear themselves inside a conversation. So when Sebastian and I met to go over that, we included not just the questions, but we included what I provide as an introduction to the question. So if you look at all of the interviews that I've had with speakers, I will often provide a bit of a narrative or a context that leads into a question. And every time I send those questions out to the speakers ahead of the conversation I have with them so that they feel a sense of confidence and purpose in responding to those questions. And I never go outside those questions. I never sort of ad lib or spontaneously ask a question that they're unaware of. I stick to the script. And because I know that every single person I've invited to speak, because they're Indigenous and they come with some, not just an obvious sort of toolkit of unique and profound perspectives and insights into this work, but they also carry some definite sense of vulnerability. Having experienced these things as an Indigenous person themselves in one setting or another, personally or professionally. So I know going in that every one of them have at some point in their life experienced that vulnerability, and sometimes that vulnerability can be a scary place. It can be unresolved. It can be a source of grief, hurt, pain. It can also be a source of great pride, happiness. Who knows? But it's very personal. Some of those questions, if you listen to them, are very personal. And every speaker I've invited at the end, when we close the Panopto link or the Zoom link off, almost every speaker has said to me, those are really tough questions. Or right in the midst of the conversation, they say, these are really tough questions. And so I just knew that if we're going to get at any semblance of the truth, you have to ask the tough questions. You have to ask the questions that are going to elicit some type of vulnerability and what is often a sacred space, a very intimate space for people. And that can be difficult to talk about. And I got to give credit to the speakers I've hosted over the last 4 years who have stepped up and been vulnerable and confident and brave in answering those questions. So with the that particular group of people, that goes back to 2022 when I hosted a panel of children of Indian residential school survivors, and and then the year after in 2023, I hosted a panel of Indian residential school survivors, and then in 2024, we brought both of those panels together, children of survivors and Indian residential school survivors. So above and beyond the questions being received ahead of time, we brought ceremony into the room. We had a very purposeful and meaningful ceremony to welcome children back home. We contracted two mental health and wellness counselors to be in the room in case any of those folks wanted to access those types of services throughout the conversation. So these are tough conversations, and particularly where the historic past is concerned, you're not just talking about sort of the stories and histories of survivors. You're talking about the implications to their descendants, to their children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, that some of these issues remain unresolved, some even irreconcilable. That as we were talking, I'm aware, particularly with that panel, that you know, some of them have children or grandchildren who are living on a street here in Vancouver. I know for certain that two of those panel members have grandchildren who are caught up in addiction here in Vancouver on East Hastings. So to ask them, you know, what do you feel about these issues? What do you think about these issues? That's a big ask. And so I have acutely aware of people's vulnerabilities around these conversations. Um, I had a dear great friend who insisted we meet and talk right after I spoke with Chief Wayne Christian, and her name was Joanne Ma. She was an associate professor in the undergraduate medical education program in the Faculty of Medicine, and she was a Chinese-born Canadian. Parents moved here from China, set up a life, and she insisted I meet with her right after that conversation with Chief Wayne Christian. And the first time we met, we might have talked for about 3 or 4 hours. Like it was just this instant friendship. And the foundation of that friendship was based on our vulnerability. And we met on a regular basis over the years. She passed away sadly in January of this year. But I got to meet her husband, I got to meet her children, I got to know who her father was and the Chinese community that she's connected to. Her husband comes from Lloydminster. His mother was Chinese, his father was Ukrainian. So I got to learn this rich history of this beautiful family that Joanne was connected to. And it was just entirely premised on vulnerability. There were many moments in those conversations where it was just raw. And it was just honest and truthful about our experiences as Indigenous peoples in this country and as Chinese people in this country. That we all have a story. We all have a unique, incredible story that brings us to this place that we all share called Canada. And in addition to all of the processes, programs, all those kinds of things that bring us together, it's our stories that are really going to bring us together, and the unique understanding about who we are and where we come from. So safety becomes really important in those conversations. I want people to leave those conversations knowing that they can reach out for help, that they're not alone, and that they need not be alone in these types of conversations. because you're asking a lot of people when you step into that space. So safety is really important. I think when you're especially inviting Indigenous or First Nations people, and many institutions are doing this, they're asking for our stories, they're wanting to hear our stories, and there's a need to tell our stories. But I think there's a real need to know that those stories are connected to histories. These above and beyond it being a story, they are literally our histories. And some of that remains yet unresolved, some of it irreconcilable, and some of it is just difficult. It's just the day-to-day stuff that determines whether I'm going to move forward, I'm going to stay stuck, or I'm going to be, I'm going to try and figure this out. So I bring that into every conversation and sort of signal to whoever I'm talking to that they're not alone, and we're forever grateful for their contribution to these important conversations.
Thank you, Derek. So I see now that we have about 13 minutes left, so I'm going to pass it off to Magda to ask the next question.
Okay. Thank you, Derek. Thank you so much for what you've been sharing today. As you're speaking, I was thinking about, as I had mentioned earlier, we here at CCECanada will soon be releasing a podcast about the experiences of boundary spanners, a lot of whom are here with us today, that group in general, I mean. And this podcast is part of wider discussions that we've been having over the past few months and years, really. And we've learned a lot from these conversations, that community engagement professionals are feeling vulnerable, as many universities, many colleges are reducing or cutting community engagement activities within, as we all know, within this austerity context at institutions across Canada. We were hearing a lot that community engagement professionals, they're often feeling challenged in supporting truly authentic and reciprocal partnerships, as resources are cut, as capacities are limited, as offices shift and their roles are shifting in this current context, this challenging context. And so related to this, I'm wondering if you could please take a few moments to comment on what you see as the current state of Indigenous engagement with universities and colleges and polytechnics. And if you have any strategies or advice for protecting and continuing meaningful relationships and these kinds of efforts.
Wow, that's a big question. That's a tough question. I like your choice of protection, right? Above and beyond continuing. How do we protect these types of important processes, particularly where our people are concerned, Indigenous First Nations people are concerned? Here at UBC, we have, like many universities, we have a process called inclusive excellence, right? So this standard that you can only do this work if you include the people that you're working towards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to the UBC Faculty of Medicine's commitments, the Faculty of Medicine here at UBC offered a formal apology in June of 2021. Of course, that included the plans, the strategies, the commitments to uphold their apology for their role in the process of oppression and assimilation of Indigenous people, so on and so forth. And that aligned with the UBC Central's Indigenous Strategic Plan and their apology linked to inclusive excellence, so on and so forth. And there's an interesting tension there that you're trying to make something not just to protect it, but you lack the ability to make it insular, right? It's not enough to just build a house. You need to insulate that house. You need to air condition that house. You need to build a fireplace in that house. It needs all of the obvious components of insulation. It's not enough to just have something that's a foundation and it has walls and it has the ability to hold something like a storage unit. But I think at least where UBC faculty medicine is concerned, so far it's just build the foundation in the house. It hasn't insulated its so-called commitments to truth and reconciliation. 4 years in to my role here as an example, I've been a team of one. So the ratio of my job as Director of Indigenous Engagement is 1 to 13,000 in the faculty. That's just faculty. That's not factoring in students. That's not factoring in the satellite UBC sites across the province, so on and so forth. So if you talk to James Andrew has been with the Faculty of Medicine for almost 30 years. He was literally did all of the foundational work to create the Indigenous MD pathway inside the Faculty of Medicine. So from 2002 until 2022, in 20 years, the faculty graduated about 125 Indigenous MD doctors. So when I started, I asked James, well, that's interesting. In 20 years, I asked James, what's the ratio of non-Indigenous doctors to that number in the same time period? And it's 30 to 1. So while you're celebrating 20 years, which you need to do, you have to acknowledge that for every 30 non-Indigenous doctors, you graduated one Indigenous doctor, right? So there's all kinds of interesting numbers that I think too many academic institutions lean on to say, wow, we graduated 125 doctors, right? Another example, the UBC Faculty of Medicine earlier this year celebrated its 75th anniversary as a faculty, and so I was brought in, into the conversation about, hey, what do you think we should talk about in terms of the Indigenous context? And I said, well, in 1950. Between 1950 and 1960, and then between 1950 and 1975 particularly, both my parents were in Indian residential schools. And there was that silence that fell across the Zoom meeting room. So Indian residential schools were still in full force in that particularly first 25 years of the Faculty of Medicine. And above and beyond that, you weren't accepting Indians into your Faculty of Medicine. And in fact, in the last 20 years, you've only graduated 125. Before that, 2001 and prior, you didn't even think about Indigenous peoples. It wasn't even part of your overall existing mandate. It wasn't until the president's office came along and directed you to include in your mandate Indigenous peoples and health. So if you look at the context of truth and reconciliation, and you can talk a lot about that, Canada and its Canadians didn't come willingly to truth and reconciliation. It was only through the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which is a legal directive to institute the formal apology. From the formal apology came the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So Canada didn't wake up one day and said, you know what? We really need to do truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Canada did not do that. It came kicking and screaming to the processes that we call truth and reconciliation. Most Canadians did not come willingly. Most Canadians didn't show up to any event involved with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission while it was doing its work to create its 94 calls to action. You'd be hard-pressed to find any non-Indigenous person at those events. And I know because I went to most of them. So, broadly, generally, it's been difficult because there are people like me and other Indigenous peoples like me that are sort of holding the faculty and other faculties accountable when it should be shouldn't didn't didn't non-Indigenous peoples make this commitment? Like, why am I saying this? Why is it only me doing this work? Right? So I think to make it insular, to really truly protect it, you need to give it a mandate, you need to give it a budget, you need to build capacity, it needs resources, it needs allies. In fact, what we need is what it looks like you already have an entire faculty committed to other things. Um, we still don't have, as part of the Dean's executive team, a vice dean in Indigenous health. My role as director of Indigenous engagement falls under the vice dean's portfolio of health engagement, right? So I've been pressing the dean in recent years to really create the vice dean role and portfolio and give that position a mandate and a budget and the ability to insulate what they've built as just a house, foundation, and walls. Otherwise, you're going to spend the next 5, 10, medium to long term, whatever the weather is doing outside, you're only protected by walls, right? So I think it's really important to really step back and consider not only what's important in terms of engagement, but what's important in your commitments to truth and reconciliation, because it falls in that context. And as I mentioned early on in this conversation, that the so-called relationship between Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks is just starting. And ignorance, at least from my experience here, remains to be alive and well. Inevitably, wherever I talk, I hear non-Indigenous folks say, I didn't know that. I didn't know about Indian residential schools. I didn't know about the Indian Act. I didn't know about segregations of Indians to Indian reserves. And there's a lot of evidence in this country that ignorance is a tool. It's a tool in the toolkit of colonial and new settlers that holds them back for one reason or another to really getting at what they need to do as colonial or new settlers. And if you sustain that kind of ignorance long enough, it mutates into prejudice. That prejudice becomes discrimination and racist. And then we start to appoint those racists, prejudiced people into positions of authority, like Duncan Campbell Scott, who then creates the Indian Act and segregates Indian into Indian reserves, creates Indian residential schools and puts Indian children in those schools. And you have mostly a Canadian society that isn't up in arms about Indian residential schools over time. You don't have any evidence almost anywhere in this country of Canada's Canadians going, hey, shouldn't we be shutting down these Indian residential schools? That seems wrong to me. In fact, you have many Canadians sitting at the sidelines going, they're just Indians. And if you don't believe me, talk to Black people in this country. Talk to Jewish people in this country. Talk to Chinese people in this country. Talk to Japanese people in this country. This country was hell-bent on being white. And that is a historical fact that many Canadians refuse, for one reason or another, to come to terms with. So it's not enough to just protect it. You have to make it insular. And a lot of that work is the need and urgency for Canada and Canadians to come to terms with its own past and have a reckoning with yourself as Canadians. And really, by doing that, you begin to feel what it's like to include us as legitimate partners in this relationship. And you start to bring more of our people, Indigenous people, into this work. And you really breathe life into processes like inclusive excellence and your commitments to truth and reconciliation, whether it's an Indigenous pathway, a Black pathway, an Asian pathway, Chinese pathway, Japanese pathway, a Hindu pathway. Um, we're here and we're here to stay. The beautiful colored people of this world, we're here and we're here to stay. And we want in and we want to contribute. We want this country to be the best it can be. And I think that's the goofy tension. I've talked to Oliver about this a number of times where Indigenous folks are concerned that, we're Canadian too, man. And we want to feel like we belong. And we want to feel like we belong based on our own terms and not based on this historical context that you tried to get rid of us, right? We're a smart people. We're a bright people. We're a beautiful people. We're a vibrant people. And we have a lot to commit and contribute to the makeup of this country. So I think it's not enough to just protect it. You got to make it insular. You got to make it feel warm and welcome. And you got to have our people involved in insulating that, right? And we need to build a strong foundation of allies and advocates who, because I'm one Indigenous man, I need people like Oliver. I need people like all of the leadership at UBC Faculty of Medicine have been very supportive of this work. And then beyond their moral support to really breathe life into building capacity and the resources around this work.
Well, I recognize that we're close to time here, but I do want to say that there's a comment that someone's made that says, "Oh, it feels good to hear this said out loud." And I think that, kind of points us to where we are, and we can't thank you enough for sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your time, to be with us today and to have this conversation. It's been really important, and we can't thank you enough. Before I close things off, Magda, did you have anything you wanted to comment on?
I just wanted to thank everyone who joined again today. Particularly, I wanted to to thank Oliver and Derek for this wonderful conversation. These really thought-provoking words, and I know that I wish we had more time to continue that discussion, because I know that I have questions and things I'm thinking about. But we'll leave it for now, and thanks to all of you very, very much. I'll pass it back
Thanks
to you, Betty.
to everyone for being here today. We know everyone's working through sometimes chaotic situations and times and things that are going on, especially at the beginning of the academic year. We don't really know where things are going in a lot of places, but we're always glad to come together with all of you and to have our special guests here today, Derek and Oliver. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We are going to hold a peer network meeting in about 2 months. We hope to see you then. We'll send more information as soon as we have a date set and a program. In the meantime, of course, please don't hesitate to connect with us on anything at all. We always do like to hear from you. And you can reach us at info@ccecanada.ca. I'm going to stick that in the comments right now, so you can let us know how to. Nope, that was the Indigenous Speaker Series. Well, I can put that up again. And Magda, can you grab that?
I can do that, Betty.
Okay, great. Just want to say again, thank you very much, Derek, for taking the time to spend with us today. Really appreciate it. Wonderful to meet you, and we look forward to seeing everybody again in a couple months' time.